The November wind swept dried leaves across the empty parking lot of Hillcrest Prison. Emily Harper adjusted the collar of her coat, standing still for a moment before the imposing steel gate. Every visit began the same way, with a pause, a flicker of hesitation, and a quiet internal battle. But as she had done every week for the past 3 years, she took a deep breath and walked steadily toward the checkpoint. "You're a little early today." "Good morning, Mrs. Harper," said Mr. Collins, an elderly guard with a neatly trimmed gray mustache. Emily smiled and pulled out her ID. The hospital changed the schedule. It was either now or wait until next week. Collins glanced at the badge as he went through the familiar ID procedure. "How's the weather out there?" "The news says snow by tonight, but so far it's just cold rain." She held out a small, clear bag for inspection. "That's good. I never cared for snowy messes," Collins muttered, inspecting the contents quickly. "Room 5 today, ma'am." Without a word, Emily followed the path she had memorized long ago. The corridors of the prison always smelled the same, a blend of disinfectant, stale air, and something indescribable, a scent she could only associate with confinement. Her heels clicked loudly on the concrete floor, the sound echoing against pale green walls, a color, she'd once been told, chosen by prison administrators for its calming effect on inmates. As she walked, her mind wandered to the day she first met Calvin. It had been 6 years ago at Goodwin & Sons auto shop. Her old Ford had taken a hit after she accidentally jumped a curb. She remembered the young mechanic with the shrewd gray eyes and an easy smile, explaining the suspension issue as she found herself paying more attention to the movements of his oil-streaked hands than his words. "So it's going to take a few days to fix?" she'd finally asked, interrupting him. "Unfortunately, yes," he nodded, wiping his hand with a rag. "But if you're in a hurry, I can stay after my shift." The repair had taken 3 hours. They had talked the whole time, seated on oil-stained chairs in the empty workshop. A week later, they had dinner at a small Italian restaurant. 2 months later, in the pouring rain at her doorstep, Calvin confessed he was in love. 6 months after that, they married at the town hall. No big ceremony, just the two of them and a few of Calvin's friends from the workshop as witnesses. Their first 2 years were quiet, but full of happiness. They bought a modest home on the city's outskirts. Sunday breakfasts in bed became a tradition. They made plans. Calvin dreamed of opening his own garage. Emily hoped to complete advanced training to become a head nurse. But everything fell apart overnight. Calvin was arrested and charged with the armed robbery of a gas station. At the trial, he didn't deny it. He said he needed the money, desperately, to pay for treatment for his mother, who had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. He was sentenced to 7 years. Emily flinched slightly as the door to the visiting room opened. A guard escorted Calvin in and nodded. "You have 45 minutes." The door closed. Calvin crossed the room in seconds, wrapping his arms around her. "I've missed you so much," he whispered, burying his face in her hair. "Me too," Emily murmured, holding him tightly. He pulled back to study her face. "You've lost weight, and you look tired." "It's okay," she said, brushing it off. "The hospital's swamped. Half the staff's out with the flu, so I'm working double shifts." They sat across from each other at a small table. Calvin took her hands, his rough and cracked from prison labor. "How's your week been?" Emily asked, skirting any direct mention of prison life. "No change," Calvin replied with a shrug. "Laundry duty. Finished that detective novel you brought last week. The ending caught me off guard. I thought you'd like it." Emily smiled warmly. "I brought a couple more from the same series." She reached into her worn tote bag and pulled out 2 tattered paperbacks, along with an auto mechanics magazine. "You're the best," Calvin said sincerely, accepting the reading material with great care, as if it were something rare and precious. "How's Buster?" he asked, his voice softening. "Still chasing the neighborhood cats?" Emily chuckled. "Our dog's getting older. These days he prefers to snooze on the porch and watch the birds go by. But every time I tell him we're coming to see you, his ears perk right up." Calvin smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "Tell him I miss him too." "It's been 3 years," he said after a pause. "For more to go, and we'll be together again." Emily lowered her gaze, her fingers fiddling with the edge of the table. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm counting the days." "No, really," Calvin continued, his tone insistent. "I want you to know, every single day in here, I think about you. About us. Our future. When I get out, we'll start over. I've been studying some books from the library on business planning. I still want to open a garage, maybe even expand it into a full-service auto repair shop." "That sounds wonderful," she said quietly, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Calvin leaned in, concerned. "Hey, is something wrong? You seem different today." "I'm just tired," Emily replied quickly, shaking her head and forcing another smile. "Tell me more about your plans." "I love hearing them." For the next half hour, Calvin talked with excitement about the life he envisioned for them. A bigger home, weekend trips to the coast, maybe even starting a family. Emily listened, nodded, asked the occasional question, but her eyes gave her away. Calvin, who had once memorized the expressions of her joy, could sense her mind was elsewhere. "Time," announced the guard, peering into the room. They stood. Calvin embraced her tightly and kissed her gently. "I love you," he murmured, "more than anything in this world." "And I love you," Emily replied, her throat tightening with emotion. "Always." "Will I see you in 2 weeks?" he asked as he stepped toward the door, where the guard waited. "Of course," she nodded. "I'll be there." When the heavy door closed behind him, she stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space he had just filled. Then she wiped the tears from her cheeks and turned toward the exit. Back in his cell, Calvin sat on the bottom bunk and reached under his mattress. From a cardboard box, he pulled out a stack of neatly folded letters, more than 100 in total, all numbered and carefully preserved. They were his lifeline, his connection to the world beyond the prison walls. "Reading your gospel again," teased Tony, his cellmate of 8 months, from the top bunk. "You read those letters like they're the Bible." "Back off, Tony," Calvin replied without anger. Tony grinned and leaned over the edge of the bunk. "I'm just jealous, man. My wife filed for divorce a month after the verdict." "You're lucky, Cal. Not many people get that kind of love." Calvin folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. "I know," he said quietly. "Believe me, I know." Meanwhile, Emily sat in her parked car in front of their home, the engine still running. A soft jazz tune played on the stereo, the kind of music she and Calvin used to listen to on Saturday nights. Now it only reminded her of an ache beneath her ribs. After several minutes, she turned off the engine and stepped out into the cool evening air. The familiar creak of the front door greeted her. Inside, Buster, their aging Labrador, barked joyfully, his tail wagging furiously. "Hi, boy," she said, kneeling to pet him. "Daddy says hi to you." Buster licked her hand before trotting into the kitchen toward his food bowl. The house was silent, just as it had been for the past 3 years. Emily hung up her coat and wandered into the living room. Their wedding photos still sat on the mantel, young, radiant faces beaming with hope. It felt like a lifetime ago. She sank into Calvin's favorite chair and pulled out her phone. A notification glowed on the screen. 3 missed calls and a message. "How'd it go?" "Worried. Call me when you can. L." She closed her eyes and leaned her head back against the cushion. Guilt wrapped itself around her like a blanket. Every time she looked into Calvin's eyes, every time she listened to him speak of their future, the weight of betrayal returned. She was holding on to a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. But didn't she deserve to be happy? Was she supposed to bury herself for 7 years while her husband served time behind bars? The phone buzzed again, another incoming call from Elle. Emily looked at the photo on the mantel, then at the phone screen. With a quiet sigh, she pressed the reset button. She didn't have the strength for this conversation today. Buster padded into the room and rested his head on her lap, his big brown eyes gazing up at her with quiet loyalty. Emily absent-mindedly scratched behind his ears, her fingers moving slowly. "What am I going to do, Buster?" she whispered. "What am I going to do?" The dog didn't respond, only let out a contented sigh and closed his eyes, enjoying the soft touch. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to drift down, settling quietly over the withered grass. November's end brought with it the promise of a long, cold, and lonely winter. Pine Ridge City Hospital never fully slept, not even during the deepest hours of the night. At 3 a.m., in the dim glow of the emergency room, Nurse Emily Harper was filling out a patient's chart when she heard familiar footsteps in the hallway. She didn't look up, but the corners of her lips quivered into a faint smile. "The night shift is wearing you down, Em," came a warm, deep voice. She looked up to find Dr. Mark Reynolds leaning casually against the doorframe. Tall and composed, his neatly groomed hair had just a hint of gray at the temples. Even after a 6-hour surgery, his scrubs were immaculate. "I thought you'd gone home," she said, attempting to sound casual, though her heart was already racing. "Got caught up in paperwork," Mark shrugged. "Want some coffee?" They just brewed a fresh pot in the cafeteria. "I've got 2 more patients." 20 minutes, Mark interrupted gently. "Even robots need to recharge." Emily glanced down the unusually quiet corridor and finally nodded. "Okay, 20 minutes. They sat together in a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria, the only people awake besides a drowsy orderly asleep at a far table. Mark studied her face over the rim of his plastic cup. "You look exhausted," he said. "Been to Hillcrest again?" Emily wrinkled her nose. "Don't get me started. I'm just worried about you," he said softly, reaching out to place a hand over hers. "Every time you come back from those visits, you're drained. It's not healthy, Em." "What's healthy?" she replied with a bitter smile. "Leaving your husband when he's in trouble, or cheating on him with a coworker, like I do." Mark recoiled slightly, pulling his hand back as if he'd touched fire. "I thought we agreed not to call it that." "We did," Emily sighed. "I'm sorry. It's just, I keep thinking he suspects something. Today he asked about my work, about coworkers." "That's natural," Mark said calmly. "He's interested in your life, but he doesn't know anything. We're always careful." She nodded, stirring sugar in a coffee that had long gone cold. "Sometimes, I think I'm losing my mind, trying to live 2 lives." Mark's gaze softened. "Em, I know you feel responsible. That's what makes you you. That's what He hesitated, then continued. "What I've come to love. But you can't keep sacrificing yourself. You're 32. How many more years are you willing to give up waiting?" She looked away, silent. In her mind, she saw Calvin's face, his hopeful eyes as he spoke of a future she no longer believed in. "Come with me to Lake View this weekend," Mark said suddenly. "No one knows us there. Just a quiet restaurant by the lake, a walk. Something normal." "I don't know," she said softly. 2 days, he urged. "We deserve that." Emily's phone beeped. "I've got to go," she said, rising. "Thanks for the coffee. Will you think about the weekend?" Mark asked as he stood with her. She paused for a moment, then nodded with quiet resolve, as if preparing to plunge into cold water. "Yes," she said. "I'll go with you." The Blue Harbor restaurant sat on the edge of a serene lake, 2 hours from the city. The small log building, with its terrace stretching over the water, glowed warmly in the dusk light. Inside, golden lamps flickered through the windows. "It's beautiful here," Emily breathed as they sat at a table by a wide picture window, watching the sunset melt into the lake's shimmering surface. "I told you so," Mark said with a playful smile as he filled Emily's wine glass. "A toast," she replied, lifting hers with curiosity. "To what?" "To the present moment," he said seriously, meeting her gaze. "To the opportunity to be yourself, if only for a little while." Their glasses touched with a soft chime. The wine was tart yet sweet, leaving behind the faint aftertaste of summer berries. As she took a sip, Emily felt the tension of the past few weeks loosen its grip just slightly. "Tell me something," she said, settling deeper into her chair. "Something that has nothing to do with the hospital or complications." Mark hesitated, then grinned. "You know, when I was 14, I wanted to be a firefighter." "Really?" she laughed. "That's a surprise. My uncle was one. A real hero type. I used to visit him every summer in Portland. I thought there was no nobler profession." "What changed?" "Broke my leg skateboarding," Mark chuckled. 6 weeks in a cast. But the surgeon I had? Incredible guy. He let me watch a surgery once the cast came off, explained everything about bones, muscles, tendons. By the end of that summer, I'd forgotten about fire engines and started reading anatomy books. "It's funny," Emily mused. How a single moment can shift your whole path. What about you? He asked, topping off her wine. Did you always want to be a nurse? She smiled a little shyly. Actually, I wanted to be a ballerina. His eyebrows shot up in surprise. Oh, don't look so shocked, she laughed. I trained seriously until I was 16. Competed, too. But eventually, I realized I didn't have the kind of talent that takes you to the big stage. I never would have guessed that, Mark said, shaking his head. But explains your walk. My walk. He grinned. You move differently than everyone else. Graceful. Like you're dancing. Especially when you think no one's watching. Emily blushed. Am I being watched, Dr. Reynolds? Only with the noblest of intentions, he replied, smiling back. Dinner flowed into a gentle, effortless rhythm. They talked about books, movies, places they wanted to visit. Carefully, they avoided topics that might ruin the evening. No talk of Calvin, the hospital, or the fragile reality they were both trying to forget. When dessert arrived, Mark's tone shifted. He reached across the table and gently took her hand. He said softly, I know this isn't the right time, but I need you to hear this. If you ever decide to change your life, I'll be there. Not today, not tomorrow, but when you're ready. Emily stared at their joined hands, emotion rising in her throat. I don't know when that'll be, she whispered, but thank you for waiting. Later, they walked along the wooden platform that wrapped around the lake. The night was surprisingly warm for late fall, and the stars shimmered like diamonds in the black sky. Mark slipped his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him without hesitation, resting her head gently against his chest. It's beautiful, she murmured, staring at the mirrored constellations in the still water. Yes, Mark agreed, but he wasn't looking at the lake. He was looking at her. When she turned to him, their lips met, tentative at first, then deepening with a hunger born of long denial. When they finally parted, Emily whispered, Take me to my room. In the hotel suite overlooking the lake, they made love with the passion of two people clinging to a moment stolen from the world. Mark kissed every inch of her skin, whispering tender words. And Emily, caught between guilt and longing, gave herself to him, desperate to forget everything else for just a little while. Afterward, lying in his arms and listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, Emily knew a choice was looming, one she could no longer avoid. To remain loyal to the man who waited behind prison walls, holding on to promises made in another life, or to step into a new one with someone who offered love, stability, maybe even a family. What are you thinking? Mark asked drowsily, running his fingers through her hair. About impossible choices, she answered honestly. Mark propped himself up on one elbow and met her gaze. You know what surgery's taught me? Sometimes you have to cut down to the bone to save the patient. It's painful. It's terrifying, but it's necessary. And who's the patient in this case? Emily asked, her voice edged with sadness. You, Mark replied quietly. And Calvin. And me. Because if we keep living this lie, we're slowly killing all three of us. She didn't respond, and Mark didn't press her. He simply held her tighter, letting her find comfort in the quiet warmth of his body. Soon, Mark drifted off to sleep, but Emily lay awake for a long time, staring into the darkness, her mind racing with thoughts. That night, she made the most important decision of her life. On her next visit to the prison, Emily felt a strange calmness settle over her. Something inside her had shifted after the weekend with Mark. It was as if the fog that had clouded her for years had finally lifted, allowing her to see a path forward. Painful? Yes. Complicated? Absolutely. But finally, she knew what she had to do. Good morning, Mrs. Harper. Mr. Collins greeted her as she approached the gate. No line today. Hardly anyone here. Thank you, Emily replied with a gentle smile, handing over her bag for inspection. Inside were the usual things: homemade cookies, a few auto mechanics magazines, and a new detective novel. Simple gifts that always brighten Calvin's days. But today, they felt different, like farewell tokens. Each item carried more weight, more meaning. When Calvin walked into the visiting room, he looked more tense than usual. As they embraced, Emily could feel the tightness in his shoulders. Is something wrong? She asked after they sat down. Nothing major, he said, brushing it off. Some drama around the block. Typical prison stuff. But his gaze lingered on her. Sharp. Focused. As if he were searching her face for something she hadn't said. How's work? Calvin asked, casually flipping through the magazine she brought. Same as always at the hospital. Any new coworkers? Just the usual, she said, working to keep her tone light. There's a new chief of medicine, but I barely see him. Calvin nodded, still studying her. I was reading the local paper at the library the other day, he said slowly. There was an article about your hospital. Isn't there a new surgical department? Emily's heart skipped, but she kept her voice steady. Yeah, that opened about a month ago. Big deal for our little town. They brought in some specialists from the capital. How are they settling in? I think they're fine, she shrugged. I work mostly in the ER, so I don't interact with the surgeons much. Their conversation drifted to safer topics, but Emily could feel his eyes still watching her, trying to read between the lines. When the visit came to an end, she almost felt relieved. Until next week? Calvin asked, pulling her into a parting hug. Emily drew a deep breath. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something. Something important. Next time I visit, I just need a little more time to prepare. Calvin's body stiffened. That sounds serious. Did something happen? No, she said quickly, trying to reassure him. It's nothing bad, just something I need to talk to you about. He forced a tense smile. All right, I'll be waiting. As Calvin returned to his cell, a heavy unease settled over him. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. Emily had changed, and not just in the things she said or did. It was in her eyes, in the way she carried herself. She felt distant. Tony, his cellmate, jumped down from the top bunk, landing with his usual cat-like grace. So, how was the date? Romeo, he teased, then paused when he saw the look on Calvin's face. Hey, you okay? I don't know, Calvin murmured, sitting heavily on the edge of his bunk, gripping the magazine in his lap. Something's going on. She's different. Not like before. Women always change, buddy, Tony said philosophically, lighting a handmade cigarette. Especially when their man's locked up. No, this is different, Calvin shook his head. For 3 years, she's been solid. Like a rock. And now, he trailed off, unable to put it into words. Listen, Tony said, lowering his voice. Remember that article I showed you last week? About the hospital's new surgical wing. Calvin nodded slowly. He remembered the group photo that accompanied the article. Among the staff, Emily stood beside a tall man in scrubs. The photographer had caught a moment, just a second, when the man whispered something to her, and she smiled. Not just any smile. That smile. The one Calvin always thought was meant only for him. It doesn't mean anything, he muttered, more to himself than to Tony. Sure, buddy, Tony said, though his tone wasn't as certain. But just in case, I asked my cousin to keep an eye out. He's a delivery guy for the hospital. Knows how to stay invisible. Calvin stared down at the photo again, his heart pounding in his chest, the magazine forgotten in his lap. He's a medical supply guy, Tony explained, trying to sound casual. Calvin stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Has he said anything yet? Nothing so far, Tony shrugged. But he promised to be careful. He'll let me know if he sees anything. Calvin gave a slow nod, a swirl of conflicting emotions rising inside him. Relief, anxiety, and a sharp stab of guilt. Was he really having his wife followed? The thought filled him with shame, but it was too late now. The seed of doubt had already taken root, and it was spreading fast, poisoning every memory of Emily. Her voice, her touch, even her laughter. She said she wants to talk next week, Calvin murmured, staring into nothing. Something important. Said she needs time to prepare. Tony let out a low whistle. I hate to say it, man, but that usually ain't good. The Hillcrest Prison Library was small, but surprisingly decent, thanks to regular donations from the town's civic groups. Calvin sat at a far table, flipping through the latest issue of the local paper. Officially, he was researching the used car market, part of his pre-release planning. But in truth, he only cared about the city news section. Find anything interesting? Asked Harold, the inmate librarian, an older guy with a gentle demeanor. Not yet, Calvin replied, turning the page, then froze. Under the Weekend in Penn Ridge column, A small black and white photo caught his eye. It showed a peaceful picnic scene at Riverbend Park. There were kids playing, people lounging, and Emily. She was sitting on a plaid blanket, laughing, leaning slightly toward a tall man. The same man from the hospital photo. The caption beneath the image read, Dr. Mark Reynolds and Nurse Emily enjoying a day off at Riverbend Park. Blood roared in Calvin's ears. His hands tightened on the page, crumpling the edges. The image blurred as his vision darkened. Her face, her posture, his hand resting casually on her shoulder. It all screamed intimacy, betrayal, proof of something he had tried so hard not to believe. "You all right, kid?" Harold asked, peering over the newspaper. "I'm fine," Calvin said, his voice strained. "Hey, can I cut this out for a project?" Harold hesitated, then waved a hand. "Sure, just don't ruin the rest of the paper." Back in his cell, Calvin slipped the clipping under his mattress and lay on the bunk, staring at the ceiling. His mind spun with the image of Emily in another man's arms. Her smile, her warmth, now given to someone else. His fists clenched so hard his fingernails cut into his palms, leaving crescent-shaped marks. When Tony returned, Calvin was sitting calmly, but his face was pale and his eyes were glassy with rage. "Hey, remember what I said about my cousin?" Tony said carefully, glancing at the door. "He's got something." "Tell me," Calvin said, his voice eerily quiet. They were together in Lakeview last weekend. Just the two of them. "My cousin works at the Blue Harbor Inn. Said they booked a room, double occupancy." Calvin shut his eyes, nausea rising in his throat. "I need help, Tony. Anything, man. I need to know how serious this is." Meanwhile, Mark was waiting at their usual cafe near the hospital. Emily was late, rare for her. When she finally arrived, her eyes were red, her face pale. "What happened?" he asked, standing to meet her. "I was at the lawyer's office," she said quietly, sitting down. "I had the divorce papers drawn up." Mark froze. Are you sure?" "Yes," she said firmly. "I can't keep living a lie. It's not fair to Calvin, to you, or to me." He reached for her hand. "When will you tell him?" "I've scheduled a visit for Friday," she replied, taking a deep breath. "I want to tell him in person. Then I'll file the paperwork." "Do you want me to come with you?" Mark asked. "I can wait in the car." She smiled weakly. "That would mean a lot. I don't know how I'll feel afterward." He squeezed her hand. "Whatever happens, I'm here. After all this, we're going to start a new life together." She smiled through her tears. "Sometimes I think I don't deserve you." "No," he said with quiet conviction. "I'm the one who doesn't deserve you. But I'm working on it." Friday afternoon arrived. In his cell, Calvin sat on his bunk, absently spinning something between his fingers. A makeshift shiv carved from a thin piece of metal stolen from the prison workshop. Its razor-sharp edge caught the dim light and shimmered coldly. Tony stood by the door, watching him with concern. "Are you seriously going to bring that to a visit?" Tony watched him with unease. "Cal, it's one thing to teach a cheating wife a lesson," he said hesitantly, "but it's another to add more years to your sentence for assault." "I just want to talk to her," Calvin replied calmly, slipping the makeshift shiv into a hidden compartment he'd carved into the sole of his shoe. "I want to show her this. I need to see the truth in her eyes." Tony shook his head. "I don't like this, buddy, but if you're set on it, I've got your back." Soon, a guard arrived, announcing an unscheduled visitor. Calvin stood, his heart thudding as he walked toward the visiting room. Every step echoed louder than the last. He knew tonight would change everything. Outside in the parking lot, Emily sat in her car, tightly clutching an envelope filled with divorce paperwork. Mark reached over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You'll do fine," he said softly. "Just be honest, but careful. Remember, he's in prison for a reason." She nodded, anxiety written across her face. "I'll be right here," Mark added, "however long it takes." Emily leaned over, kissed him, then stepped out of the car. Her legs felt shaky as she approached the checkpoint. "This is the right thing to do," she told herself. "Calvin deserves the truth, and I deserve a chance at happiness." The security screening went as usual. Mr. Collins, the elderly guard on duty, noticed her distress but didn't press. "Everything all right, Mrs. Harper?" he asked kindly. Yes, thank you, Emily replied, forcing a smile. It's just an important conversation. I understand, he nodded. Room 3. Not many visits tonight. You'll have privacy. Room 3 was smaller than the usual spaces. It sat quietly at the end of a narrow corridor. Emily entered and sat down, folding her hands tightly on the desk, struggling to slow her breath. She felt like her heart was trying to outrun her. Then the door creaked open, and Calvin walked in. Hello, she said softly, not yet able to meet his eyes. Hi, Em, he responded, and there was something unsettling in his tone, too quiet. It made her spine tingle. The guard exited, leaving them alone. Only the faint mechanical buzz of the security camera remained, watching from a corner in the ceiling. Calvin sat across from her, unreadable. You said you had something important to talk about, he said, his gaze never leaving her face. Emily inhaled deeply. Yes, Cal. This isn't easy, but I need to be honest. She paused, trying to find the right words. My life has changed a lot over the past year. I met someone. Mark Reynolds, Calvin interrupted. Emily froze, her mouth open in shock. The surgeon from a new Lake View clinic, he continued, his voice disturbingly calm. The one you spent the weekend with at Blue Harbor. Color drained from her face. How did you? Calvin slowly reached into his pocket and unfolded a wrinkled newspaper clipping, laying it flat between them. The city paper, he said evenly. The weekend in Penridge section is quite informative. Emily glanced down. The black and white photo was undeniable. Her and Mark on a picnic blanket, his hand on her shoulder, her smile unmistakably affectionate. The moment had been innocent in intent, but there was no denying the intimacy in the image. Cal, she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. I was going to tell you today. I came to explain everything and to file for divorce. He glanced at the envelope she held. I figured, he said, his expression unreadable. Emily noticed a glint in his eye then, something dark, unsettling, a mix of heartbreak and something far more dangerous. I never meant for you to find out like this, she said softly. I'm sorry. I didn't plan this. I didn't mean to fall in love with someone else. 3 years, Calvin said, his tone suddenly cold. 3 years I've sat in this place, holding on to hope, planning our life. And all this time. No, Cal. Emily interrupted quickly. Not the whole time. It started about 8 months ago. I fought it. I really did. But I've been so lonely. Calvin stood abruptly, and Emily instinctively leaned back. Her eyes flicked to his hand, moving toward his shoe. Cal, please, she said cautiously, her voice trembling. Let's talk calmly. At that moment, the camera in the corner rotated slightly, a routine shift in angle. For a few seconds, they were in a blind spot. You betrayed me, Em, Calvin whispered, pulling the sharpened shiv from his shoe. You betrayed everything between us. The last thing Emily saw was the flash of pain and fury etched into the face of the man she once called her husband. She had once loved him. And then, darkness fell. The cold November wind whipped across the prison parking lot as Mark Reynolds checked his watch for the third time. Emily had been inside for over an hour, far longer than expected for what was supposed to be a difficult yet straightforward conversation about divorce. A creeping unease settled into Mark's chest. He knew how painful this day would be for both of them, but something didn't feel right. Something told him this wasn't just about words anymore. Something had gone wrong. Then it happened. The shrill cry of a siren pierced the air. A metallic clang echoed as the main gate of Hillcrest Prison slammed shut. Seconds later, a police cruiser with flashing lights sped past the lot, followed by an ambulance. Mark's heart jumped into his throat. He leapt from the car and sprinted toward the gate, where a small crowd of visitors had begun to gather, confused and alarmed, caught outside by the sudden facility lockdown. What's happening? He demanded breathlessly, approaching an elderly guard posted at the gate, whose face was drawn with tension. Emergency inside, the guard replied gruffly. No one gets in or out until we're cleared to stand down. But Mark hesitated, unsure what word to use. Wife. Lover? My friend, he settled. She's inside. Emily Harper. She came to see her husband. The guard looked at him with a flicker of recognition and something else. Sympathy. "You'll need to wait here, sir," he said, his voice softening just slightly. He turned back to his walkie-talkie, which crackled with sharp commands. 20 minutes after the first call, Detective Adam Carter arrived at Hillcrest. In his 22 years on the force, he had seen plenty of tragedy, but it never got easier. The sight of police cars crowding the yard and the coroner's van parked at the rear made his stomach turn. Warden Thomas Blake met him at the gate. A tall man with a stern, military presence and weary eyes. Blake offered a firm handshake. "Detective Carter," he greeted. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "What do we have?" Carter asked, already glancing toward the building. "Murder. During visitation," Blake said shortly. "Inmate Calvin Harper stabbed his wife. Multiple times. She was dead before the paramedics even arrived." Carter's face darkened. How the hell did he get a weapon? "Homemade shiv. Hidden in the sole of his shoe. We're investigating now to see if a guard was involved." As they made their way through the quiet, locked-down prison, only low murmurs drifted from behind the steel doors. Every inmate had been confined to their cell. They reached visiting room 3, now sealed with yellow police tape. Forensics teams worked inside, snapping photos and collecting samples. Though the body had already been removed, the streaks of blood on the walls and floor told a grisly story. "Cameras?" Carter asked, scanning the corners of the room. "There." Blake pointed. "But we have a problem. Protocol rotates the camera periodically. At the moment of the attack, it was turned to the opposite wall. We only caught the beginning of the conversation and the aftermath. Where's the suspect now?" "Downstairs. Holding cell. He didn't resist arrest. When the guard arrived, he was just sitting there next to her body." Carter nodded grimly. "Bring me to him." Calvin Harper sat motionless in a cold metal chair. His hands were cuffed to the table. Dried blood stained the sleeves of his prison uniform. When the detective entered, Calvin didn't even glance up. His face was pale, empty, the expression of a man who had lost everything. "Mr. Harper," Carter said, taking the seat across from him. "I'm Detective Adam Carter. I need to ask you a few questions about what happened today." Calvin lifted his head slowly. His gray eyes were lifeless. "She's dead," he said quietly, voice flat. "I killed her." Carter switched on the recorder. "Can you walk me through what happened?" "She betrayed me," Calvin replied, speaking as if in a trance. "She came here to tell me she was leaving me. For someone else. A doctor." He pulled something from under his cuff, a blood-stained, crumpled newspaper clipping, and slid it across the table. Carter studied the photo. Emily, seated in a park next to an unfamiliar man, his arm around her shoulder, her face glowing with affection. "Did you plan the murder ahead of time?" Carter asked bluntly, looking up from the picture. "I wanted to," Calvin said, his voice low, searching for the right words. "I just wanted to see the truth in her eyes. I needed her to admit it. And that's why you brought a shiv with you?" Detective Carter asked, his tone measured but pointed. "That suggests premeditation." Calvin shuddered, as if shaken out of a trance. "Is he out there now?" he asked suddenly. "Who?" "Her lover. Mark Reynolds." Calvin spat the name like poison. "I don't know," Carter replied, though he made a mental note to confirm the doctor's whereabouts. "Let's go back to what happened in the visiting room." Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds sat in the sterile waiting room of the police station, waiting to give his statement. He was numb, trapped in a waking nightmare. His Emily was gone. The thought was impossible, ungraspable, like a dream turned monstrous. The door opened. A tall, middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a weary expression entered. "Dr. Reynolds, I'm Detective Adam Carter," the man said as he took a seat across from him. "I'm leading the investigation into the death of Mrs. Harper. I need to ask you a few questions." "What happened?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse. "All I was told was that she—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Carter nodded with quiet understanding. "I'm sorry. Mrs. Harper was stabbed multiple times by her husband during visitation. She died before medical help could arrive. He's already confessed." Mark buried his face in his hands. "It's my fault," he whispered. "I should have gone in with her. I should have been there." "Tell me about your relationship with Mrs. Harper," Carter prompted gently. Mark drew a long, steadying breath. We met 8 months ago. I just transferred to Penridge Hospital. She was working in the ER. At first, it was just friendship. She told me about her husband, about how hard things were. And then it became more than friendship? Yes, Mark nodded. She fought it, though. She felt guilty, deeply guilty. She didn't want to betray Calvin. But in the end, she decided being honest was the right thing to do. She prepared the divorce papers. She went today to explain everything in person. And how long had you two considered yourselves a couple? Carter asked. About 3 months, Mark replied. We kept it quiet. We traveled to nearby towns for weekends. Emily didn't want rumors to reach Calvin before she had the chance to tell him herself. Carter jotted something down in his notebook. Did Calvin know about you? We didn't think so, Mark said bitterly. Obviously, we were wrong. He showed me a newspaper clipping, Carter said, pulling it out. A photo from Riverbend Park. You and Mrs. Harper. It must have been taken on one of those weekends. Mark stared at the image. The memory stabbed at him. One of their rare, joyful moments. God, he whispered. So he knew. And she still went to face him. She was brave, Carter said quietly. She believed in telling the truth, no matter the consequences. Mark nodded, his throat tight. That's why I loved her. Back in Carter's office, the clock read 3:30 a.m., but the detective wasn't going anywhere. He stared at the spread of documents in front of him. Crime scene photos, the coroner's report, witness statements, and a transcript of Calvin Harper's preliminary interview. He pressed play on the surveillance footage again for the 100th time. Still working, Carter? Lieutenant Morrison entered the room, a cup of coffee in hand. Something's off, Carter said, rubbing his temples. It's all too convenient. The camera rotated away at the exact moment of the attack. The guard stepped out for just a second. The weapon slipped through multiple checkpoints. You think someone helped him? Morrison asked, taking a seat on the edge of the desk. Maybe, Carter muttered. Or maybe Harper just knew the system too well. Knew exactly when the blind spots would be. Either way, Morrison said, we need to be sure. In his prison cell, Calvin Harper sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at his blood-stained hands. The same hands that had once caressed Emily's face had now taken her life. The numb shock was fading, replaced by a suffocating grief that wrapped around his chest like chains. There was no turning back, no forgiveness, no future. He had destroyed the only thing in the world he had left to live for. He sank to his knees and wept, deep, rag sobs that tore from his chest like something ancient and broken. For the first time since childhood, Calvin Harper cried. The pain was dry and unrelenting, each breath a stab of grief. What have I done? He whispered into the cold silence. God, what have I done? The next morning, Detective Carter returned to Hillcrest to follow up on Calvin and speak with prison staff. Warden Thomas Blake met him with a tight expression, jaw clenched as though bracing for impact. Our internal audit uncovered several violations of protocol, Blake reported, avoiding direct eye contact. Guard Griffin admitted he may not have thoroughly searched inmate Harper before visitation. Not thoroughly enough? Carter interrupted sharply. Are we talking negligence or complicity? We're investigating further, Blake replied evenly. But initial evidence suggests Harper paid for the leniency, with cigarettes and prison currency. Carter nodded and made a note in his worn leather-bound notebook. I need to speak with Harper's cellmate. Tony fidgeted nervously in his seat, his hands in constant motion, eyes darting anywhere but the detective's face. Look, I didn't know anything for sure, he began, his voice low, eyes fixed on the hem of his prison robe. Cal was off, yeah. That picture in the paper really messed him up. But I thought he just wanted to talk to his wife, maybe scare her a little. Did you know about the shiv? Carter asked bluntly. Tony hesitated, clearly weighing the consequences. I saw him working on something, he admitted at last. But I swear, I didn't think he'd use it. Cal, he loved her. Even after he found out about the affair, he still did. Loved her enough to kill her, Carter said grimly. That's the thing. Tony leaned forward, lowering his voice. Cal was hot-tempered, sure, but he wasn't a cold-blooded killer. Something broke in him that day. It wasn't planned. It was like a switch flipped when he saw that picture. Across town, Mark Reynolds sat alone on a park bench across from Penridge Hospital, where he and Emily used to meet for lunch. The November wind whipped through his hair, but he didn't flinch. His mind was locked in the past, in memories of her smile, her laughter, the life they'd hoped to build. Dr. Reynolds, Carter's voice came from behind him, steady and respectful. "May I sit?" Mark nodded, shifting aside. "Any news?" "Just finalizing the details," Carter replied. "I need to clarify something. Did you know Mrs. Harper was afraid of her husband's reaction?" "Yes," Mark answered, clenching his fists. "She told me Calvin could be impulsive, explosive, especially about fidelity. That's why we waited so long to tell him. But she was brave. She wanted to tell him face to face. Said he deserved that much." Carter gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "Did she talk to you about her plans after the divorce?" "We wanted a fresh start," Mark said quietly. "Maybe move to another city. She dreamed of a house with a garden. Children." His voice broke, and he looked away. "Thank you," Carter said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And I'm sorry for your loss." 3 days after the murder, Carter returned to Hillcrest one final time, to hear the full story from Calvin Harper himself. The man before him was visibly changed. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, a ghost of the person he had been. "I'm ready to sign a confession," Calvin said, as soon as Carter entered the room. "Full confession. Premeditated." Carter switched on the recorder. "Go ahead." "I found out through the newspaper," Calvin began. "At first, just a photo from the hospital ward opening. Then another at the park. I don't know why the reporter focused on them. Maybe he recognized our name from my arrest." He paused, swallowed hard. "I had Tony and his cousin keep an eye on her. They told me about Lakeview, the hotel. I was losing my mind with jealousy. I saw them together in my head every night." "Is that when you decided to kill her?" Carter asked. "No," Calvin replied, shaking his head. "At first, I just wanted to scare her. Let her know I knew. I sharpened the shiv. Paid the guard to skip a full check. That's all I had planned. But when she sat across from me, talking about the divorce, about the new life she was planning with that doctor, I snapped." His voice cracked, tears gathering in his eyes. "My vision went black. I couldn't hear. I couldn't think. The only thing I remember is the look in her eyes. Fear, confusion, and then blood. So much blood, and the guards pulling me away." He placed his hands over his face and wept silently. "I don't deserve forgiveness. I took the life of the person I loved most in this world." Detective Carter quietly finalized the paperwork, collecting the final signatures. The case was practically closed, a textbook crime of jealousy, complete with a full confession and irrefutable evidence. A week later, Carter sat in his office wrapping up his report on the Harper case. The silence was broken by a knock at the door. In walked Laura Bennett, the prison psychologist from Hillcrest, short, sharp-eyed, and known for her clinical precision. She held a slim folder in her hands. "Detective Carter, do you have a moment?" she asked. "I've prepared a psychological profile of Calvin Harper for the court. I thought it might interest you." Carter motioned for her to sit. "I've been observing Calvin for 3 years," Laura began. "His case is a textbook example of emotional obsession. His entire existence inside those walls centered on his wife, her letters, her photos, her plans. He built an idealized version of their relationship, one that shattered the moment it collided with reality." Carter nodded. "That fits. That's exactly what happened." "There's more," Laura continued. "Over the course of his incarceration, Calvin actually learned to control his emotions. His anger episodes became less frequent, less intense. In fact, around Emily, he had developed notable restraint. That's what makes the violence of the attacks so atypical." Carter frowned slightly. "What are you getting at?" "I'm saying the brutality of the murder. Multiple erratic stab wounds, continuing even after the victim lost consciousness, suggests more than rage. It was a full psychological collapse. A total break from reality triggered by unbearable emotional pressure. This wasn't just an outburst. It was psychosis." Carter leaned back. "That won't change the verdict." "No," Laura agreed. "I just wanted you to understand. He's not a monster, Detective. He's a man who lost the only thing anchoring him to sanity, and he broke." When she left, Carter remained seated, staring at a photograph recovered from Calvin's cell, a smiling wedding photo of Calvin and Emily. In another, taken at a hospital event, Mark Reynolds stood beside them. 3 people in search of love, security, and belonging. And each of them had paid dearly for that search. Carter slowly closed the case file. Sometimes, the simplest crimes come from the most complicated hearts and leave behind the deepest tragedies. Life doesn't always give us second chances. Emily believed in honesty, in confronting the truth, even when it hurt. Calvin believed in love, but let jealousy consume him. And Mark, he believed that love was enough to save someone. In the end, all 3 of them paid the price for the choices they made. This story reminds us that unspoken pain can fester into something dangerous. That when we bottle up emotions instead of facing them head-on, the consequences can be tragic, not just for ourselves, but for the people we love most. So if you're holding on to something, say it. If you're hurting, reach out. If you love someone, show them in ways that heal, not in ways that destroy. Because some wounds don't get time to heal. If this story moved you, or made you think, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We share true crime stories that dive deep into the human heart every week. Like, share, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next one. Until then, stay safe and take care of each other.